In this video, we introduce the grammatical basics, the forms, and the functions of Koine Greek infinitives. So as to our basics, when we talk about an infinitive, we're talking about a verbal noun. If you remember back to participles, remember that a participle is a verbal adjective. And it's called a verbal adjective because it takes parts from verbs. That is, it takes tense and voice from verbs. And it's an adjective because it also takes case, gender, and number. An infinitive is a verbal noun because it takes the idea of the verb, the pure idea. You see in our examples here, to die or to beg, the sort of core idea of the verb, and can also use that core idea in a way that's like a noun, namely as a subject or as the object of another verb in the sentence. So an infinitive is a verbal noun, a participle is a verbal adjective. As I just alluded to, an infinitive is called as such because it refers to the pure idea of the verb. It is not limited by person and number. So you don't have the limitations of who is doing the action of the verb, but rather with the infinitive, the whole idea of the verb is being referred to. And this is why we normally, or one of the most common ways to translate the infinitive is with the phrase to, and then whatever the particular verb is that we're translating. As a verbal noun, infinitives are also going to take parts from verbs. They're going to have tense and voice, but unlike participles, they are not going to have gender, case, gender, and number. Rather, they're just going to have tense and voice, and then because they're not limited by the person and number of the verb, you're not going to have that as to your parsing information. So when you go to parse an infinitive, you're going to offer the tense, the voice, and the mood is the infinitive, and then the lexical form. So for example, lu ain is our ending for the infinitive here. We're going to look at those endings in just a moment. We have a present active infinitive from luo. And lastly, as is the case with all non-indicative verbs, or all non-indicative moods, I should say, the infinitive is going to be negated with the negative particle may rather than the negative particle u. The negative particle u is the particle that negates indicative verbs that we've seen quite often in this class. May is going to be what negates non-indicative moods like participles or the infinitive, or as we'll see later on, what is called the imperative mood. Moving on to our formation of the infinitive. We have sort of four basic forms or four basic endings of the infinitive that you should be able to recognize. Ain, I, nigh, and sty. And here I give you where these different endings are used. And sort of a handy hint here is that if you recognize that all of these end with either ain or alpha iota I, if you can recognize those two, and there's going to be one exception to this that we'll see in later on in the video, but if you can remember that these two are the endings for the infinitives, that's going to go a long way for helping you be able to recognize an infinitive when you go to translate them in a Greek sentence. And so what we're going to do is I'm going to show you how all of the different forms of the infinitive, how they form based on their root and any things that they add to that root, or any ways that the root changes, and then what ending is added on. We're going to go through these relatively quickly, and on the next slide what I'm going to do is sort of bring them all together to show you in one chart what all of the different infinitive forms look like. So to form the present active infinitive, you're going to just take the verbal root, the present tense root, and then add this ain ending to it. For the present middle passive, you're going to do the same thing, take the verbal root, but add esthe. So the epsilon here is technically the connecting vowel, and the sty is our infinitive ending. For the second aorist, we're going to get a changed root, as we always do with the second aorist. This is what characterizes the second aorist. The present root changes to a different root, and you're going to get that ain added on. So notice that we have very similar formation here. The present active infinitive and the second aorist active infinitive are often going to look similar to one another, but you have to be able to recognize that second aorist root. So for example, balain with a single lambda is going to be which one of these? Present active infinitive or second aorist active infinitive? That's right, second aorist active infinitive, because the root has changed. This comes from balo. So if we were to have a present active infinitive, we would have balein with 2 lambdas. With the loss of a lambda, we know we have the second aorist root there. With the second aorist middle, we have, again, the second aorist root. We again have a connecting vowel like in the present middle passive, and then we have this thigh ending. For a second aorist passive infinitive, the second aorist is not going to have the theta eta that the first aorist passive is going to have, and we'll see that in just a minute. We remember that theta eta is our characteristic, and then also theta epsilon is characteristic of the passive voice in a variety of different moods. But when we have the second aorist passive, we just have the eta. For the first aorist active infinitive, we have the sigma alpha. There's this I ending is the first aorist active infinitive ending, and you can sort of think of the saw of the aorist tense formative, that alpha there combining with the alpha here to have just 1 alpha rather than 2 there. For the first aorist middle infinitive, you're going to get that saw again, then with the sty ending. And the first aorist passive infinitive, we talked about this just a moment ago, you do get the full theta eta put onto the verbal root with that nigh ending. And then lastly, our 2 perfect forms. The perfect active infinitive is going to use reduplication. So it's going to have reduplication and then the verbal root and then kainai. So that kappa, as we've seen elsewhere, is going to be a signal to the perfect tense. And then with the perfect middle passive, once again, we're going to get reduplication, a verbal root, and then the sty ending. Notice that for both of these, we don't have a connecting vowel. That was also the case with the perfect tenses in the indicative mood. And lastly, notice that there's no augment on any of these. And this is especially relevant, of course, for those that are aorists. So remember that the augment only is an indication of the past time. It's only an indication of the imperfect or the aorist tense in the indicative mood. So in participles and with the infinitive, you are not going to get an augment. And so if we were to put this all together into one chart, we get something that's a little bit more simplified. So when we had all of these listed up here by formation, that might get a little bit more overwhelming to you. Here we have them in one chart with our active, our middle, our passive, and then the various tenses of the infinitive that you're going to see. And you'll notice that there's only present, aorist, and perfect infinitives listed here. And that is because these are the overwhelming majority of infinitive tense verbs in the Greek New Testament. There are also a handful of what are called future infinitives in the Greek New Testament, but they're so rare that we're not going to overcrowd your mind by introducing their forms here. So you can see that what we've done here is taken these forms and put them into a chart so that you can recognize infinitives from this chart when you see them. Going back to some grammatical basics. So we started with basics, we went to some formation of the infinitive, and now we're going to return back to the basics of the infinitive. As I just said, we only have, there are 3 very common forms of the infinitive in the Greek New Testament: the present, the aorist, and the perfect. And these do not strictly refer to the time of the infinitive, but they refer to the kind of action. And you'll remember that we've talked about the present tense and the imperfect tense referring to ongoing or continuous action. I usually depict it as a squiggly line like that. The action is ongoing before the eyes of the speaker of the right or the writer. So to be loosing. And then aorist is always going to be completed action. The action is viewed as a whole in past time. It's viewed as a whole in the indicative, usually in past time. But when it's in the infinitive, it's just to loose. It's the whole idea of loosing rather than to be loosing, the ongoing nature indicated in that present tense form. And then the perfect tense is a state in the present that is based on action that was completed. So the action happened and then continued to have results. So the state of being, the results they come from what happened in past time. So all this to say, we're going to have these 3 different tenses, and normally you're going to translate them something like this: to be loosing to get the ongoing nature, to loose to get the action as a whole, and then to have loosed to get the idea of the action being completed but having continued effects. And then the other thing to note about the infinitive is that all those kinds of changes that we have seen with different kinds of verbs, so or that we've seen for different reasons, we would call these morphological changes. They are changes to the morphology or the form of a word, and they result because of the combination of different letters. We're going to also see those in the infinitive. We're not going to go through all those changes, but those changes that you have learned in previous lessons are going to be at play for the infinitive as well. So for example, certain verbs that end with certain consonants, when they come into contact with the psi ending of the first aorist infinitive, there's going to be amalgamation, that sigma is going to combine with certain letters, amalgamate with certain letters to produce a new letter. We're also going to see, of course, changes in the stem of second aorists, and contract verbs are also going to have contractions. They're also are still going to have contraction when a vowel is added to them. And I noted at the very beginning of the video that there is an exception to ain being one of the two combinations of letters that are used. The other one was I to indicate the infinitive. And the exception here is that with contract verbs, they use n, epsilon nu, rather than ain as their endings for the infinitive. So you won't see that epsilon occurring in contract verbs, but you will often see the circumflux as the sign of the infinitive in contract verbs of the infinitive. So for example, you'll see something often like in with a circumflux over it, or on with the circumflux over it, indicating that some kind of contraction has occurred between the ending of the infinitive and the stem vowel of the contract verb. And then lastly, when a verb is middle or deponent in a tense in the indicative, in that same tense in the infinitive, it is likely to be deponent as well. So, and remember, deponent means what? That's right. It is middle in form, but active in meaning. So don't be surprised when you see aorists that are, when you see infinitives that are middle in form, but you translate them actively. They're going to follow that same pattern that they do in the indicative. If they take a middle deponent form in the indicative, they're likely to do the same in the infinitive. A little bit more here, we have the fact that infinitives can take neuter singular articles. So what you will often find is one of these three articles. This is both the nominative and the accusative form. And of course, we have the genitive and the dative here with an infinitive after it. So you'll see plus the infinitive. And when this happens, the verb is being referred to as a concept, to sort of as you think of it as the idea, the act, or the fact of the verb. So here, ta thelein, by putting this ta in front of it, it's doing what is called substantizing the infinitive itself, or substantizing the idea of the verb, so that thelein is made into then an idea or an act or a fact of wishing. When an infinitive has one of these articles, it can also be the object of a preposition. So we'll see something like in tow plus the infinitive. And we'll talk about what that means a little bit later on. But so when an infinitive has an article before it, it can also take a preposition before it. And sometimes that meaning of the preposition will remain the same. So you might have something like peri plus to, the genitive, definite article plus the infinitive, and peri is still going to mean something like about or concerning, but we're also going to see that certain prepositional phrases with the infinitive have special meanings that we'll talk about in just a moment here. And then also infinitives as verbal nouns can take a subject and an object. So the verbal part of the verbal noun of the infinitive can take a subject, and when it does take a subject, that subject is going to be in the accusative case. So I give us an example, a biblical example of this here with ha Petros lege to Iesu. So Peter says to Jesus, Rabbi, kalon esten hemas enai hode. So, Rabbi, it is good for us to be here. So us is the subject of the infinitive anai. Notice that this is an accusative personal pronoun. It's functioning as the subject of the infinitive. We are the ones being here, even though it's not in the nominative case. And then the confusing, one of the confusing things about this, or what might be confusing, is that the infinitives can also take objects as well as subjects. So here we see the infinitive taking a subject, but it can also take an object, and it will take its object in the accusative case. So the infinitive takes its subject and its object in the accusative case, and there will be occasions where an infinitive has both a subject and an object, as right here. So we have an example from Paul where he says, dia ta ekein me in te cardia humas. So if humas is the subject of ekein, which is the verb to have, because you have me, then me would be the object in your heart, in te cardia. Or if me is the subject of the infinitive and humas is the object, then it's translated this way: because I, me, in the accusative, have you, humas, as the object in the accusative, in my heart. And this is the one that we go with, and this is the correct translation because of this handy rule right here. If we have an infinitive that has two accusatives, one as subject and one as object, the subject is almost always going to come before the object in the sentence. So notice that me comes before humas, so we know that this is going to be the subject into the infinitive rather than humas, rather than this one here. So what I want to do is get you to review some of this information that I just presented to you on both the basics and the formation of the infinitive. So pause the lecture here, grab your whiteboard, and write answers out to these 10 questions, and I'm going to do the same. All right, here are my answers. Whether or not yours all match up, let's go in for a high five for the work that you've done here. 1, 2, 3, high five. Boom, well done. So what we have here, infinitives are verbal adjectives. This is false. Participles are verbal adjectives. Infinitives are verbal nouns. And the importance of that, of labeling it a verbal noun, is to help us remember these facts right here, that an infinitive can be the subject of the verb and it can be the object of a verb. So like a noun, an infinitive can be the subject of another verb or the object of another verb in the sentence. The infinitive is not limited by person and number. So when we parse an infinitive, we don't give person and number. An infinitive doesn't inflect or doesn't change its form for person and number. An infinitive is negated by me rather than u, and this is the case with all non-indicative moods. The two-letter combinations are ain, with the slight exception of in, epsilon nu for contract verbs, and then alpha iota. Infinitives do not receive an augment in the aorist. The augment only occurs in the indicative mood, but infinitives will reduplicate in the perfect, or to form the perfect. And then lastly, both the subject and the object of the infinitive is in the accusative case. So let's talk a little bit more about the uses or the functions of the infinitive. And there's going to be, these are sort of broadly construed into two different categories. Some that are more closely related to the verbal sense of the infinitive, and that's what we're going to present first. And some that are more closely related to the noun sense of the infinitive, which is going to be on our right-hand side of the screen here. So the most common use of the infinitive is going to be what's called the complementary infinitive, where the infinitive is going to complete the idea of a verb. So this happens especially with verbs that sort of really beg to have something else complete them, like dunamai, I am able to something. So you need the infinitive to finish the idea of this verb. Same with fellow, I wish something, I wish to something, to do something, or arkomai, I begin to something. So our translation is going to be to, and then whatever verb the infinitive is in. The infinitive is also often used to indicate purpose in the Greek New Testament, and this happens in 3 different forms. One is just the infinitive with nothing else accompanying it. Another one is the neuter singular article to with the infinitive following it. So remember we said that infinitives can take the definite article. In this case, when there's a to ahead of it, you can often expect or usually expect it to be indicating purpose and translated to or in order to. And the same with eis ta, this prepositional phrase, eis, then with the neuter accusative singular definite article followed by whatever infinitive. Similar to purpose is result. It's going to be with the conjunction hoste with the infinitive. We're going to translate it so that. And then the infinitive can also be used in different time constructions. So that pren a with the infinitive or just pren with the infinitive without an a. Both of these constructions mean before. In to is going to mean while, and we're going to, of course, add whatever the infinitive is after all of these. Meta ta with the infinitive is going to be after whatever verb, and you'll normally translate it verbing, ing at the end. And then heos ta plus the infinitive is going to be until verbing. And then our last sort of adverbial use of the infinitive is going to be the causal use. And it's going to be translated as its name implied, because, and its form is going to be dia, the preposition dia, with the accusative neuter singular article ta with the infinitive following it. Moving over to our sort of noun related functions of the infinitive, we have the infinitive functioning as the subject or the object. We've already talked about this. Oftentimes we'll see it with the article ta or with the accusative article ta. So the article is accusative when it's the object. It's a nominative when it is the subject. And then the other very common use of the infinitive that sort of is very similar to the complementary infinitive, but is used for nouns, is what's called the ep-exegetical infinitive. And it's gonna usually come after a noun, and it's gonna further explain that noun with respect to the verbal idea that's contained sort of in the infinitive itself. So we'll see some examples of this in the homework for this week, where we have a noun and then the infinitive following it is the ep-exegetical infinitive. And it's very similar, again, to the complementary infinitive, but the complementary infinitive is following a verb. It's completing the idea of a verb, whereas the ep-exegetical infinitive is completing or modifying the idea of a noun. And so then what I've given you here, and I've given you this also in a single PDF document, a single PDF page, is the different functions of the infinitive. Sort of a cheat sheet for looking back to how the infinitive should be translated when you come across it in a Greek sentence. And then the last thing we're going to do here is another quick quiz where I'm going to ask you to identify the different uses or functions of the infinitive from different sentences here. And rather than put them all up at the same time, we're going to go one by one so that I can make some comments on them. So go ahead and grab your whiteboard, and I'm going to give you both the Greek and a translation, and I will give you I will ask you to go ahead and pause the lecture, take a look at the sentence, and see if you can identify which kind of infinitive or which function of the infinitive we have with each one. I'm going to pause and write down the answer as well. All right, for this one we have the infinitive of purpose. Notice we have the eis ta before it, which corresponds to our other words that are accompanying the infinitive of purpose. So they led him to crucify him, or with the purpose of crucifying him. Number 2, go ahead and pause and find which function we have here. So here we have an example of the ep-exegetical infinitive. You are worthy. So worthy is an adjective here, and I wasn't as explicit as I should have been on that last slide, that the ep-exegetical infinitive can modify not only a noun but also pronouns and adjectives. So here, to receive the book is giving us more information about worthy. It's completing the idea of worthy, telling us why the lamb is, or what is worthy about the Lamb, worthy to receive the book. So you are worthy is a perfectly fine sentence, but when we add more information, we modify it with labein ta biblion, it tells us the sort of content of why the Lamb is worthy, or what the Lamb is worthy to do in this case. So number 3 here, once again, let's go ahead and pause. So here we have the infinitive of time, which the translation here gives you a strong sense of with before, but we have the prin, which means before, and it's going to take the infinitive after it. So truly, truly, I say to you, before Abraham was, or before Abraham existed, ego eimi, I am. 2 more here. Go ahead and pause and do number 4. And of course, with our English translation, because, we have a causal infinitive. Notice that there's a dia ta with the infinitive. In this case, it's negated though, because it did not have root. And notice that the may is used to negate the infinitive and not u, because may is used to negate non-indicative forms. And lastly, pause and go ahead and find the use or function of number 5 here. And for our last one here, we have a complementary infinitive. This is completing, poiesai, the infinitive, is completing the idea of dunamai. So notice that dunamai is one of the very common words that's going to take a complementary infinitive. And there are going to be other Greek indicative verbs that take complementary infinitives, but these are just the 3 most common ones in the Greek New Testament. So do you all believe that I am able something? And then we get the something with the poiesai to do this. So notice here that our infinitive is poiesai, and I normally mark an infinitive with 2 underlines. And tuta is going to be the object of the infinitive, the object of the doing. It's accusative. It's a neuter accusative singular. So by form, it could be the subject or the object of the infinitive, but it doesn't make any sense as the subject. So it must be the object here. Do you all believe that I am able to do, poiesai, this as the object? So this completes our video on the infinitive. Well done on the 2 quick quizzes, and well done with all the work that you've been doing here on the infinitive.